December 22nd, 1944. A frozen road outside a small Belgian town called Bastogne. Out of the white morning haze, 4 German soldiers come walking toward the American lines under a white flag, their breath clouding in air far below freezing. They are not attacking. They are messengers. One of them carries a typed letter, folded with care, addressed to the American commander of the surrounded forces inside the town. The message is a demand for surrender, polite, formal, and utterly certain of itself. The Germans believe they are offering the trapped Americans the only reasonable way out of a hopeless situation. They expect, if not gratitude, then at least sense. What came back was a single word. And it was a word the German command could not quite bring itself to believe. This is not the story of Hitler's last great gamble in the West, the massive surprise offensive that carved a bulge into the American line in the winter of 1944. Or rather, it is that story, told from the one place the Germans were most certain of victory and where their certainty shattered. This is the story of the surrounded, freezing, outnumbered Americans the German army was absolutely sure would break, and the refusal that broke Germany instead. The question hanging over that snowy road should have had an obvious answer. Bastogne was encircled. Its defenders were low on everything a man needs to fight and to live. The weather was murderous. By every rule of war, they should have surrendered. So why didn't they? And what did that refusal end up costing the Third Reich? To understand it, you have to go back 6 days, to the moment the quiet broke. By December of 1944, most of the Allied High Command believed the German army in the West was finished, beaten, exhausted, falling back toward its own border. The Ardennes, a region of dense, hilly forest along the German-Belgian frontier, was considered a quiet sector, a place to rest tired divisions and blood-green ones. It was thinly held, lightly watched. It was exactly the sort of place a broken army could not possibly attack. That was precisely why Hitler chose it. In the pre-dawn dark of December 16th, the forest erupted. Hitler had secretly massed a huge force, hundreds of thousands of men and a great fist of armor, for one last desperate throw of the dice. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. Punch through the weak American line in the Ardennes, race for the Meuse River, and drive on all the way to the port of Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies in two and, in Hitler's fantasy, forcing them to the negotiating table. It was the old German way of war, the sudden, overwhelming thrust summoned up one final time. And in the first hours, it worked. The thin American units in the path of the assault were overrun or thrown back. A great bulge began to swell westward into the Allied line, the bulge that would give the battle its name. But an army driving through that broken country could not simply flow across it like water. It had to move on roads. And in the tangled hills and forests of the Ardennes, the roads all seemed to run through one place: Bastogne. Bastogne was not much to look at, a modest Belgian market town. But on the map, it was a spider's web. 7 paved roads met there, converging from every direction. For the German offensive, racing against the clock toward the distant river, those roads were the arteries of the whole attack. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the flow of the advance. The Germans needed it. And the Americans, realizing the same thing, decided it had to be held. Here, the story narrows from the sweep of armies down to the men who were about to be trapped. In a desperate scramble, American command rushed reinforcements toward the town. Most famously, the 101st Airborne Division, pulled out of rest, thrown onto trucks, and driven through the night toward a battle they knew almost nothing about. Many of them arrived short of everything. Some lacked winter coats. Some were low on ammunition before the fight even began. They rolled into Bastogne as German columns were closing in from multiple directions, and they dug in around the town in a rough ring. A thin perimeter of foxholes scratched into frozen ground. Then, the ring closed. By around December 21st, the German advance had swept past and around the town on both sides, and Bastogne was surrounded, an American island in a rising German tide, cut off from the rest of the army, with the enemy on every side. Now, live for a moment in one of those foxholes, because this is what surrounded actually meant. It is one of the coldest winters in memory. The temperature sits well below freezing, and the snow is deep. The ground is frozen so hard that digging a proper hole is a battle in itself. Men have no way to get warm. Lighting a fire means drawing artillery. Frostbite creeps into feet and hands and takes its own steady toll, filling the aid stations alongside the wounded. Food is running short. Medical supplies are running shorter. The surgeons are running out of the basics they need to treat the growing number of wounded. And the ammunition, the one thing that has to last, is being counted round by round, gun by gun. Artillery crews are told to hold their fire unless the target is worth it, because there simply is not enough. The men are exhausted, freezing, hungry, and low on the means to defend themselves, and the enemy is all around them. To the German commanders looking in from the outside, the conclusion was obvious. This was over. No sane force, in that condition, in that weather, with no way out, would keep fighting. And so, on December 22nd, they sent that party under the white flag with the formal demand: surrender the town or face annihilation. It was, in their eyes, a courtesy. The demand made its way to the acting American commander inside the perimeter, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, and his response has echoed ever since, precisely because of how it deflated the towering certainty of the men who sent the ultimatum. His official reply, sent back to the German command, was a single word: nuts! It was such an American answer that the German officers reportedly could not understand it. It had to be explained to them that this piece of blunt slang was not a yes, and not a request for terms. It was a refusal, flat, total, almost cheerful in its defiance. The surrounded, freezing, half-starved Americans were not going to surrender their impossible position. They were going to hold it. And holding it, in that moment, looked like a death sentence. Because the defiance did not change the arithmetic. The men in the foxholes were still surrounded, still freezing, still running out of everything. The Germans, stung, pressed their attacks harder. What kept Bastogne alive through those darkest days was not one dramatic stroke, but the stubborn, grinding refusal of thousands of individual men to give way. Artillerymen rationing shells, riflemen holding the line in the tree lines, medics working without the supplies they needed, everyone colder and hungrier by the day. The perimeter bent. It did not break. And then, on December 23rd, the thing they had been praying for finally happened. The sky cleared. For days, thick winter cloud had grounded the one weapon that could change everything: Allied AIR power. Now, as the weather broke, the skies over Bastogne filled with aircraft. Wave after wave of transport planes roared over the town and rained supplies down by parachute into the perimeter: ammunition, rations, medical supplies, the very things the defenders were running out of, drifting down under canopies into the snow. A besieged force that had been counting its last bullets was suddenly, from the air, being handed the means to keep fighting. But the clearing sky did something else too, something far worse for the men who had drawn that noose around the town. Out beyond Bastogne, the German columns that had been advancing under the cover of cloud were now naked. And the Allied fighter bombers came down on them like a storm. Across the whole battlefield, the swarms of aircraft fell upon the exposed German armor and trucks strung out along the roads and began tearing them apart from above. The great offensive, which had depended on speed and surprise and had been shielded by the weather, was now exposed to the full weight of Allied air power. The advance began to wither on the roads. Picture it from inside one of those German tanks, out beyond the town. In the first days, everything had gone to plan. The advance had smashed through the American line and rolled west, and the crew could feel the old triumph of the breakthrough, the sense that the enemy was running. Then the roads began to clog. Ahead lay Bastogne, and the roads they needed all ran through it, and Bastogne would not fall. Traffic backed up on the icy forest tracks. Columns bunched together, nose to tail, waiting for a path that never opened. The precious hours bled away, and then the clouds lifted, and the crew heard the sound every German soldier on the Western Front had learned to dread. The rising scream of Allied fighter bombers, diving on the stalled column with nowhere for the tanks to hide. Men scrambled from their vehicles into the snow as the road erupted around them. The great offensive, which had lived on speed, was now a line of stationary targets strung out under a clear sky. And the fuel gauge told the rest of the story. The German plan had gambled, in part, on capturing Allied fuel along the way, because Germany did not have enough of its own to reach the river. When the advance stalled and the fuel dumps were not taken, the tanks began to run dry. A crew that had started the offensive full of confidence now faced the most humiliating end a tank crew can imagine. Not destroyed in battle, but stranded, drained, forced to abandon a perfectly good machine at the roadside because there was nothing left to put in it and no time left to wait. The spearhead of Hitler's last great attack simply coasted to a halt in the snow. Now, pull back to the wider map, because while Bastogne held, a rescue was already grinding toward it through the ice. And the way it arrived is one of the most remarkable feats of the war. To the south, General George Patton and his Third Army had been driving east in an entirely different direction. When the crisis in the Ardennes broke, Patton was asked how quickly he could turn his army north to relieve Bastogne. The answer he gave seemed impossible. He proposed to disengage his forces from one battle, wheel them roughly 90 degrees, and drive north through the dead of winter to reach the town in a matter of days. It should not have been possible. Turning an army in its tracks and sending it in a new direction is one of the hardest things in warfare. And doing it over 100 miles of icy roads in the worst weather of the year, against resistance, sounds like fantasy. Patton did it. His divisions swung north and force marched through the snow and cold toward the encircled town, smashing into the southern flank of the German salient. On December 26th, the lead tanks of his relief force punched through to Bastogne and broke the siege from the outside. The island had been reached. Back inside the perimeter, a young paratrooper in a frozen foxhole would not have known any of the grand strategy. He knew his feet had gone numb days ago. He knew to count his rounds. He knew that when the transport planes came over on the 23rd and the sky filled with parachutes, some of them carried the ammunition and the bandages that meant his corner of the line could hold one more day. He did not think of himself as the hinge on which Hitler's last offensive turned. He was simply a cold, tired man who had been told to hold and who held. But thousands of men exactly like him, each holding his own small piece of frozen ground and refusing to let go, added up to the thing that broke the German attack. And here is the reckoning the whole story was building toward. The Germans had staked their last great offensive of the war on speed, on driving deep and fast before the Allies could recover. They had been certain that the trapped garrison at Bastogne, freezing and surrounded, would fold and free up the roads they so badly needed. Instead, The Americans they had written off refused to break and held the crossroads that the entire offensive depended on. The German spearheads denied those roads, slowed and tangled, and lost the one thing they could not afford to lose: time. And as they stalled, the weather cleared, the airplanes came, and the fuel began to run out. In the end, the great armored thrust that was supposed to reach a distant river did not die in a grand climactic tank duel. It froze in place. It ran out of gas far from its objective, its vehicles abandoned in the snow, its momentum gone. Hitler's last gamble had failed, and it had failed, in large part, at a single Belgian town that would not surrender. For the German soldier who had watched that white flag go forward on December 22nd, so sure that the Americans inside had no choice but to give up, the lesson of the following days must have been bitter, almost beyond words. The men they had dismissed as beaten had not only refused, they had held, been resupplied from the sky, been rescued through an impossible winter march, and had helped bring the entire offensive to ruin. The contempt with which the ultimatum had been sent curdled, over those days, into something much colder. This was an enemy that did not behave the way a beaten enemy was supposed to behave. The Battle of the Bulge would grind on into January before the Bulge was finally erased and the line restored. It was among the largest and costliest battles the American army ever fought, and the price paid in those frozen forests was terrible. But its turning point had come at Bastogne, in the refusal of surrounded men to accept a defeat that looked, from the outside, like simple common sense. In the end, the Germans had asked a reasonable question. They looked at a surrounded, freezing, outnumbered garrison and asked it to see reason and surrender. And the answer they got back, a single, blunt, unkillable word, turned out to be the sound of their last offensive dying. The German command spent that winter learning what it costs to underestimate men who have decided they will not break. The road to the Meuse ran through Bastogne, and Bastogne would not move.